Hey class, this is James. Thanks for tuning in today for our plant starting class. I apologize for the delay this week. The additional process of capturing content with video and formatting it to work online has proved to be quite a bit of extra work, but I'm totally committed to doing it with pleasure, so thanks for being patient. At any rate, we will be looking at plant starting today, both in the greenhouse and in the field. So keep in mind that this is a general overview, and depending on your specific crop plan, some of these techniques may or may not apply to you this year, but it's all good stuff to know. So let's get started. So let's start by making an important distinction between two approaches to planting. The first is transplanting. This is where we plant a plant that has already been started or established. It could be an annual plant like a tomato that was started in a greenhouse, or it could be a perennial herb that we dug up from another bed. So that's transplanting. Direct seeding is the second form of planting that we're looking at today. And this is where we plant seeds directly into the field. The seeds could be annual like carrots or beets, or they could be perennial like wildflower seed. So let's just look at the pros and cons briefly of these two different planting techniques. So starting with transplanted crops, because that plant's already got a head start in, say, the greenhouse, it's going to have a head start over the weeds too. So it really reduces the amount of weeding, especially if you incorporate mulching with transplanting. It's going to be a huge reduction in the amount of weed pressure and labor associated with that. It's going to be ready to harvest quicker from the time you plant it. So because it got that head start indoors like in a greenhouse, the days to maturity from the time you plant it will be much less than if you had started it from seed in the field at the same time. This is from the crop guide, the crop planting guide. It says it's easier to replant an area to another crop or cover crop, and this is true to an extent, but the techniques that we're going to look at next class with bed establishment, that is going to show you all that really direct seeding crops doesn't really create much extra work as far as turning around a succession. Anyway, we'll look more at that later. For some vegetables, the only way to guarantee it'll reach maturity. So some plants that have a really long days to maturity timeline, those plants, if you have a short season, which we really don't at the latitude we're at in Oklahoma, but like let's say you lived up in Canada, your growing season might be pretty short, relatively speaking. So being able to start those plants indoors could be crucial to actually getting a harvest. Disadvantages of transplanting. You need to produce the seedlings or buy them. So if you're going to produce the seedlings yourself, you're going to need some type of indoor grow space like a greenhouse. We'll look at some other options too later on in the presentation, but you're going to need that dedicated space, and it's going to need to have the right components, the right environmental conditions to be able to support plant growth until you transplant it outside. So that's one of the disadvantages. If you don't have that space, even more of a disadvantage would be the fact that you would have to buy the plants that you're going to transplant. Transplants can be very, very expensive, anywhere from $1.50 to $4 a pop, depending on what you're buying. So that can really start to add up. Transplanting takes time. So where's that time going? That time is going into growing out the seedlings, right? It does take time to grow those out, to pot them up if they need it, to make sure the plants are watered in the greenhouse, to make sure the temperature's dialed, etc. So it takes a little bit of time, I guess, more so in the field as far as planting than, say, using like a precision seeder, as we'll check out here in just a minute. But not that much more time, especially when you factor in the weeding that's associated with establishing direct seeded crops. So we'll look at all that here in just a sec. But those are the pros and cons of transplanting by and large. Direct seeding, on the other hand, because you're direct seeding the seeds right into the field, you don't need a greenhouse. You don't need to buy seedlings. It's if you have a precision seeder, it's very quick and easy work to do direct seeding. And it's easy to seed an unplanned row, right? So, you know, if you decide you want to plant more of something, you know, last minute, you can just go grab your seeder and go seed a bed. Whereas with transplants, you would have needed to have started those plants well in advance. So it takes a little bit more planning on the front end. Disadvantages with direct seeding. Germination can be a problem, right? Sometimes when you're direct seeding, you need to overseed in the field to account for certain seeds not germinating in the set. So when you're transplanting, you're taking plants out there and you're controlling the spacing. So there's a lot more control with that. It is totally vital to control weed pressure in a direct seeding scenario, because your seeds are coming up at the same time the weed seeds are. And hate to break it to you, but a lot of the annual weed seeds that are going to be in your garden, maybe even perennial too, those are going to be a lot more vigorous in general compared to your annual vegetable plants. So by direct sowing seeds into the ground, you're putting your plants, you know, right in the competition zone as the existing weed seed bank. So it takes some diligence to manage that weed pressure, a lot more so than if you had done transplanting and mulched around your transplants. So whereas transplanting takes more time, you know, to actually do the planting, direct seeding can take way more time to actually address the weed pressure that's usually involved in a direct seeding scenario. So different crops are typically either transplanted or direct seeded. So depending on your crop plan this year, that will inform if you are going to be doing more transplanting, more direct seeding, or both. So let's break it down into the two buckets, the transplanting versus direct seeding, and let's look more in depth at each. So we'll start with transplanting. So some commonly transplanted crops here: tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cucurbits, which includes cucumbers, squash, head lettuce, cabbage, broccoli, basil. The list keeps going, but these are commonly transplanted crops. Transplants are going to be started in containers and grown out 4 to 8 weeks before planting in the field. So you're getting that head start, but you also have to be ahead of the curve. You got to know when you're wanting to get your crops in the ground. Usually that's determined by the outside temperature, right? If it's a warm season, that's going to be determined by the last frost date. If it's a cool season, you want those crops to be able to mature before it gets warm. So you're going to work backwards from, you know, your harvest to days to maturity from planting it outside, and then you're going to work back from there to see when you need to have stuff started in the greenhouse. You must have access to a greenhouse or an indoor setup with grow lights. We'll look at both. Or you're going to need to buy seedlings, which, like I said, can be very, very expensive, especially if you're, you know, scaling up to medium to larger scale market gardens. It definitely takes planning, and it takes time in the greenhouse, and we'll talk more about the specifics of that, but it does take some time up front. But there's a payoff later, because it gives a big head start over the weeds. You can see in this picture These are onions that were started in the greenhouse, and then eventually they were taken out and planted in the field. And when we did that, the onions were already 6 inches tall, so we were able to plant them at the spaces we wanted, and then we were able to mulch around them, and you can see the mulch just totally suppresses those weeds, and we were able to mulch around the onions because the onions had that head start, so we weren't covering up the onions. They were we're letting them poke through and get that advantage, get that sunlight, while suppressing the weeds with the mulch. All right, so let's get into growing seedlings for transplants, because that's really what we're interested in. I mean, it's just really cuts into your bottom line if you're gonna be buying seedlings at any sizable scale. So if you're gonna start your own seedlings, you got to make your own potting mix. You can buy potting mix too, pre-made, but oftentimes it's a little too potent for new seedlings, and it's expensive. You really don't want to be paying $10 a cubic foot for potting soil mix. So if you want to make your own, it's a simple recipe is a 3-part recipe. So it's 1 part peat moss or coco coir, 1 part perlite, and 1 part compost. So if you break that down, the 1 part peat moss or coco coir, that is for moisture retention. It really helps hold moisture like a sponge. You're gonna the greenhouse, if it's indoors in a greenhouse or on a shelf inside, the watering's all on you, so it's not gonna rain on your starts, so they can dry out pretty quick, especially if it gets hot in there, and it does. So that peat moss or coco coir, that's gonna help retain moisture. I prefer to use peat moss. The reason is coco coir, because it comes from cocoa palms, they're grown near the ocean, you get a lot of salt spray on the husk, so the coir will be high in potassium and sodium salts, which can burn little seedlings. So I usually use peat moss. I think it's typically cheaper too. You can buy a bale of it for like 20 bucks, and that's going to give you like 6 cubic feet. You're going to need 1 part perlite. 1 part perlite, that's for the drainage. It creates pore space in the soil so that you don't get low oxygen conditions, anaerobic conditions in the soil. Perlite is a natural geological material. It's like a rock that's been heated to a high temperature, and it makes it puff, kind of like a popcorn kernel. The third component is compost. So peat moss, coco coir, perlite, although the coir can be high in salts, the rest of it doesn't have the nutrition that plants need. So that comes from the compost. The compost is going to have the minerals that it takes to support those plants while they're grown in containers for a few weeks. All of this mix can be reused. So whatever doesn't get transplanted into the garden, that can all be combined together. You typically want to sterilize it. So like you can put it on a tarp and then drag it out into the sun in the summer and cover that with like clear plastic sheeting, and that'll solarize the soil for like a day or two, and that should help break any pathogens or disease cycles going on, because you don't want those being reintroduced to the greenhouse the following year. All right, so here's a little demo of making some potting mix. So I'm taking this tarp. I like to mix my potting mix on a tarp. Some folks will do it in a wheelbarrow, or at a potting bench, and that's totally cool, but I think the tarp is really nice to work with. So I'm assembling my ingredients here. So I had some coir on hand. I'm out of peat moss, so I went ahead and used some coco coir, which is a fine substitute for peat moss. Both have their flaws as far as being ecologically sustainable. It'd be really cool to see somebody develop a local alternative to coir and peat moss. I've heard of folks utilizing leaf mold, which is basically just composted leaves, and we have an abundance of leaves. A lot of them go to places like Gym Dirt, but that gets mixed in with other ingredients like cow manure and mushroom compost and stuff like that. So, you kind of have to use what's available, but it would be really cool to see folks start using leaf molds instead. There's a bale of peat moss, which is almost empty. I prefer peat moss over coir when I have it. So this material right here that I'm adding, I added the coir. This is the compost. So this compost is from Full Sun Composting. Natalie and Dawn, they have a commercial composting operation. They will deliver compost to you, I believe, for $75 a cubic yard, and that would be more than enough to fill a greenhouse with starts, and also to top dress, quite a large space with an inch of compost. This third ingredient's the last, and this is the perlite. This is that rock material. Looks like styrofoam, but it's not. But this is what provides pore space and drainage in the mix. So there's a little close-up. You've probably seen that in potting mixes before. So those are the three ingredients. So there is one more ingredient I add. It's not a bulk ingredient, it's a supplemental ingredient. It's the mycorrhizal fungal inoculant. And what this does is it's supposed to aid in nutrient availability and root development in plants. So I'm trying to get really strong plants established before they go out in the field. And also it's going to carry that inoculant eventually into my garden. So that's worth looking into. So here are the three ingredients, all in a pile. I'm going to start mixing them together. And again, I'm using a tarp. You can use a wheelbarrow. That's fine. They even have, like, if you're doing this on a way larger scale, like if your niche as a farmer was like a nurseryman and you were starting plants for other farmers or gardeners to sell, you'd probably have like some sort of more industrial mixer, like I've seen folks use like those concrete mixers. But on a small scale, you can just use a wheelbarrow or a tarp. And the tarp is really cool because you can peel it, like I'm doing right there, and it folds the material over on itself. And when you have two people, I was by myself when I was filming this, but when you have two folks, you can each grab two corners and you can kind of move it back and forth and mix it really fast. That I learned that technique when I was studying natural building, when I was studying cob. But you can get it mixed together pretty easily on a tarp. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go grab my tray and my 6-packs, and I'm going to bring those over to the tarp. So the tray is what holds the cells, right? Whether you're using 6-packs or 4-inch pots, it doesn't have holes in it, so it also holds moisture, kind of like a reservoir. And those 6-packs have little slits in the bottom, and they can drain or wick moisture up. So you can, the 6-packs, 6 of them fit per tray, so that gives you 36 cells per tray. So now we're gonna fill these 6-packs up. So you just take a 6-pack, put some soil in there, grate it down, and pop it back in your tray. And you just do that until they're all filled. Here's a little look at kind of what the soil mix looks like. That's making a potting mix. You're also gonna need containers. I'll show you what the containers look like, but basically you need a holding tray that's gonna hold all your individual containers. It's also gonna catch water, so you have to water a little bit less. If you use holding trays, you can kind of use it like a reservoir, and the individual plant containers can wick that moisture up. You're gonna need 6-packs. 6-packs are smaller plant cells. that go within the tray. So I think you can fit 36 6-packs on a tray. And then you're also going to need, in some cases, 4-inch pots. So usually you start your seeds in the 6-packs. Some plants will need to be up potted to, like, say, a 4-inch pot, and that's what you see in the picture here. These are tomatoes. So they start to get kind of tall, they start to get kind of leggy. They're going to be in the greenhouse. Tomatoes specifically, they'll be in the greenhouse for 6, maybe even 8 weeks, depending on how big you're trying to grow them out. And those 6-pack cells, they really just won't support the plants for that long. The roots will outgrow the space of the container. So these 4-inch pots are for plants that need to be potted up. Like I mentioned, you're going to need to constantly water your greenhouse. So it's not to keep everything soggy. We don't want the soil to be soggy. We want that balance of air and water, right? But it's to keep things moist, like at least as moist as a wrung out sponge. When it gets drier than that, it's time to water again. And because the greenhouse doesn't receive rainfall, the plants inside don't benefit when it rains. All the watering is on you. Greenhouses can also get quite warm, and that creates evaporation, in which case, water is being lost from the soil. The soil moisture is going down. So you got to keep up with watering in the greenhouse. Forgetting to water for a week could spell disaster. You're going to need adequate lighting. So whether you're growing in a greenhouse or you're growing indoors with artificial light, you're going to need at least 6 hours a day. 8 to 10 is probably preferable. But make sure wherever you site your greenhouse, make sure that it gets that sun, and make sure that sun is there at the time of year that you need it, right? So the sun angles change from the equinoxes to the solstices. So you want to know what time of year you're going to be needing that sun, most likely throughout the winter and spring. So you're going to want to design your greenhouse to capitalize on that, on those solar angles. You may need additional heating. So certain seeds germinate when the soil temperature reaches a certain level. So you can use things like heating mats. These are mats that lay underneath your trays, and they plug in and they generate heat. And you can have those on a thermostat controller. So when the soil reaches a certain temperature, the heating mat shuts off. So that's one way to do heating. The other way to do heating is with like a space heater. So you can incorporate space heaters, either electric or propane, into your greenhouse if you're getting stuff started really early and it's still cold out, or if you're going to have maybe just a couple nights during the spring season where we get a cold front and it drops super low. So you want to be prepared to do whatever it takes to keep the environment conducive to the plants you're growing in there. Because, like, for example, here we have tomatoes growing. These tomatoes were probably at this size in March. So we could still get some really cold weather in March, and the greenhouse is somewhat insulated, but if it's cold for a couple days, the temperature is going to drop in there, and that could damage the plants. So be prepared to manage the cold temperatures, but at the same time, be prepared to manage the hot temperatures. So a greenhouse can be anywhere from 20 to 35 degrees warmer than the temperature outside on a sunny day. So if it's March, we can also have days that are 75, 80 degrees. Well, that could mean that it could be anywhere from 95 to 110 degrees in the greenhouse, and that can also be detrimental to your plants. So greenhouses need to be ventilated. You can do two different types of ventilation. You can do passive ventilation. That's where you have vents at the top of the greenhouse and vents at the bottom, and it allows the heat to escape through the top, and then that creates a vacuum of relatively cooler air that'll enter through the bottom. That can work if it's designed well. I was a little less confident in that system, so I went with the active ventilation, which is basically a fan, and that fan is plugged in to a thermostat controller. So when the thermostat reaches a certain temperature, I think I have mine set to like 75 degrees right now. When it reaches 75, it's going to kick that fan on, and it's going to start exhausting warm air from the greenhouse. So we have our flat. Let's take it to the greenhouse for planting. The flat is the tray with the 6 packs there. Once we get into the greenhouse, we'll bust out our greenhouse calendar, and this calendar is all based off of our crop plan. So we've already done all the math. We know what to plant and when to plant it. Now we just have to do the planting. So today's the 3rd, and if we go down, it shows that we need to plant 1 flat of tomatoes. So 6 packs on a tray. I'll start by making the divots to the appropriate depth for the seed that I'm planting. They say you want to plant seed about 3 times the size of the seed in depth, right? So there's those little seeds. We want it to be, the depth of the hole to be about 3 times the size of that seed. And I put about 2 to 3 seeds per cell just to make sure we're going to get good germination. So once that's been done, we can go through and start covering the seed with soil. We want to make sure the seeds have good seed to soil contact. That's going to promote the highest rates of germination versus the seed just kind of sitting on the surface. Some seeds are so small you can sow them on the surface, and then when you water them in, it'll work them into the right depths. But for tomatoes, we made the divots and just covered them by hand. This little shot here, it's not the best, but it'll pop up here in a second, the water that we use. So we use a watering wand, and it has a head on it that basically simulates, a light, gentle rainfall. And this is just perfect for greenhouses. So that's the watering tool that we use. So as you're planting in the greenhouse, you're gonna want to log your activity on a greenhouse log. So you're gonna want to say, today on the 4th of April, I planted Cherokee purple tomatoes. The seeds were from Botanical Interest, and I planted 1 flat, which had 36 cells. This is going to help you keep track of what you did this year, so when you're making your crop plan next year, you can adjust and adapt. So I wanted to show you the potting up technique. So the potting up technique is when we've started a plant in, say, like a 6-pack, and then it outgrows the 6-pack and we need to pot it up to something larger. So this is pretty common with tomatoes. So what you can do is you can take like a spoon and pull out the single cell, and it might have multiple tomatoes in there because you seeded 2 to 3 seeds per cell, and if you have good germination, great. You can put a little hole, and with tomatoes you choke all the way up to the leaves because the root hairs on the stem will actually form new roots, so you can get really robust root systems. But I'm potting those up to 4-inch pots, and they'll stay in the 4-inch pots until they're ready to be transplanted. The 4-inch pots will allow them to get much bigger and develop before going out into the field. Not all crops require potting up. So I wanted to give you a little look at my greenhouse. It's small and modest, but it works for the scale I'm at. So on the south side there, that's south facing on an east-west orientation, we have the twin wall polycarbonate panels, and those let light through, but they're also insulative because there's an air gap in between the walls. On the inside here, you can see like our west facing wall doesn't have paneling. Paneling isn't really needed on the west facing wall because that's where the summer afternoon sun would come in. There's our fan up there, and the fan, the exhaust fan, runs into a thermostat controller. You can kind of see, you can set the temperature at which that thermostat controller will kick on, and when it reaches that temperature in the greenhouse, it kicks on and starts exhausting warm air from the greenhouse. So that's really critical. It is attached to our house, so we can benefit from sun in the winter. And in the winter, to keep it warm, there's been a few nights we had to kick on the space heater there. We have a little electric space heater on the ground there, but we have to use that. I think we only had to use that like 2 or 3 nights. Okay, what if you don't have a greenhouse? So alternatives to greenhouses, we've mentioned this alternative on the right, using like racks and grow lights. The advantages are you don't have to build a greenhouse. These racks are pretty cheap to assemble. The lights aren't too bad either. You can fit quite a bit in a small space because you're utilizing that vertical space, but the caveat is, you can see it in the picture, what happens if the plants are growing too tall, too fast, and they're not, the temperatures or conditions aren't right for that to be transplanted outside yet. So that can be a concern. You can see these plants right here, they're growing into the light, and those are going to start getting burned by the light. And if your lights are really strong, that could even become a fire hazard. So that's something to think about. Making sure you don't start your plants so early that they get too tall for the system before it's time to transplant them. On the left, I stole this picture from my friend Blake, and Blake, he does things on the cheap. So I guess he has all these Dixie cups. He probably cut some holes in the bottom so that there's a little bit of drainage, and he sets his stuff outside. Okay, pros: you don't need a greenhouse if you do it like Blake, but you are gambling a little bit. You're rolling the dice, because what happens if a thunderstorm comes through? That whole setup right there could just be devastated by like a really acute, intense rainfall event. Also, what happens if you get a late frost? He's got warm season plants outside, and sure, on most days in the spring, that's fine. But what about when we get a cold front like the other day, and a freeze comes at night? All those plants have to be moved. I don't see that he has those on trays. Maybe he's picking up the entire table and just moving it like into his garage with the help of another person. It's viable, it could be done. And maybe this is where you have to start before you can get your own greenhouse built. But those are some alternatives. Obviously, you're going to have way more control, way more stability with an actual greenhouse. And greenhouses don't have to fit human beings. They just have to fit the plants. So, of course, it's nice to have a greenhouse that you can step into and work inside, especially on a cold day. But you can also build cold frames, which are basically just way smaller greenhouses that just accommodate the plants. So we are ready to take our transplants out into the field and plant them. So we're going to look at our calendar. Our calendar is going to say, okay, today you're planting cabbage. And then we're going to look over at our crop plan reference sheet, and we're going to say, how many bed feet of cabbage are we planting? How many rows per bed? And what's the inner row spacing? So we've already done all this legwork in our crop plan, so now we can just take this information out to the field with our transplants and get the work done. Also, make sure to log your planting activity in your field log when you're done doing your transplants. So let's look at transplanting. So I'm going to transplant into this bed today. This bed was deep mulched, so that means it's going to have very few weeds. I'm going through right now and just pulling some stalks from last year. Maybe there's a few perennial weeds that need to be addressed, but by and large, it's a pretty clean bed, and it's already got the mulch there, so it's going to be perfect for transplanting. So I used leaves last fall. You could use straw, whatever's available. I'm experimenting with leaves. And when you peel back those leaves, you're going to see it's clean. It's ready to go. So I'm going to have very little weed pressure. So I'm taking these brassicas out of their 6-packs. I have a little digging tool there, and you're just going to plant it so that the soil level is level with the actual soil level in the field. So I have a little spacer there, kind of breaking up the roots if they've been a little root bound in the pots, and popping those in at the appropriate spacings. When I do my second row, I'm going to stagger it, and that's going to maximize space in the beds. So you can see I've kind of triangulated that second row right there. And that's really that. I peeled back the mulch just to show you how clean the bed is, but you really don't have to do that. That was really just for demonstration. You can also see that there's already irrigation in place. I just left that in place intentionally last year, so irrigation's all ready to go. And I'm coming back and I'm putting the mulch back. Typically, I'm not even going to remove the mulch when I'm transplanting. I'm just gonna dial my spacing and peel back the mulch just enough to get that transplant in the ground. And I think I'm about to give a demo of that, so let's plant another one here. Grab another 6-pack, pull out a brassica, and I think I'm looking for cabbage. There it is. Okay, and I'm going to use my spacer, put it down. That's where the next one goes. It's right along the irrigation line. That's also helps as a guide for keeping your rows straight. And I'm just gonna pop that in, tuck the mulch back, and that's it, right? So those transplants are gonna have a really, really good head start over any weeds that may come up through that mulch. But again, it's gonna be really minimal, especially if you went through and kind of pulled some of the perennial weeds. But as far as annual weed pressure, it's basically non-existent in this bed. So there's a little bit of a close-up there, kind of peeling back the mulch, peel back the soil a little bit, pop it in, tuck it back, and put the mulch right up there. And our brassicas have a great advantage. So as you can see, we were able to plant all those transplants without doing any tillage because we didn't need to disturb the soil. The mulch did that for us. And the soil just gets better and better every year. All right, so that's what we're gonna cover with transplanting for today. Next, we're gonna go into direct seeding. If you have any questions specific to your context with transplanting, something we didn't cover today, please send those questions over to me and we can address those. So here at the top, we have some commonly direct seeded crops. If you want a more complete list, refer to Appendix A in your crop planting handout. So like we said, direct seeded crops, they're sown directly in the field. So you don't need to have a greenhouse, you don't need to grow out seedlings, you don't need to buy starts. But you do need to have clean beds. And what I mean by clean beds are beds that have low weed pressure, that have been prepared in such a way where when you direct seed your crops, you're not going to be in a extremely direct competition with lots of weed pressure. So we got to get that weed pressure under control. We're going to talk a lot more about that next class in bed preparation, but that is the trade-off. Direct seeding does go very fast if you're broadcast seeding or if you're using a precision seeder. So the first approach we'll talk about with direct seeding is broadcast sowing. Here are some commonly broadcasted crops. These are crops you'd most likely see in like a salad mix. So instead of having fewer individual plants per bed that get larger, with broadcast sowing you're going to have a lot more individual plants that don't get as large, right? So you don't need a precision seeder to do broadcast sowing. You can just broadcast seed by hand, but you really do have to hone in on dialing your density. You don't want to seed too densely or not dense enough. Too dense, your plants will be stifled by each other, right? Like over competition, and none of them will reach an acceptable size for harvest. Not dense enough, you're going to have a lot of space in between your plants and you're not maximizing the yield. per bed foot, and you're also opening up a niche for weeds to get a foothold. The seeds do need to be worked into the soil because they're just being sown on top, and I'll show you some tools in the video that you can use to do that. Weeding is already a concern with direct seeding, right? Weed pressure can be really high because you don't have that immediate, opportunity to mulch around the crop. You got to let the crop establish, but also at that same time, you have weed seeds that may be trying to get established in competition with your crop. It's even more so of something you want to consider in a broadcast sowing scenario, because when you're broadcast sowing, because your plants are so tight, you can't really use mulch as a tool to suppress weeds, and you can't really work a hoe in between those tight spaces. So it really will come down to hand weeding. So again, you really want to make sure your weed pressure is mitigated, especially in a broadcast sowing scenario. All right, so let's go through the steps. The first step would be to remove whatever weed prevention measures you put in place in the fall. So this is either like deep mulch, so you'd rake that deep mulch back, or what's a little bit easier is just to use like a billboard tarp. So I'm peeling that billboard tarp back, and underneath it is a nice clean seed bed. You can weigh that billboard tarp down with like sandbags, preferably, but whatever you have on hand, rocks, firewood, whatever. Once you have that billboard tarp peeled back, if you have irrigation lines in place, just go ahead and move those out of the way. You don't have to disconnect them. You can just kind of bend them back, and they'll go right back into place when you're done seeding. After you have that out of the way, you're able to get in there with like a leaf rake and clean up the seed beds. So, if you have residual mulch or leaves, other organic matter, you can just kind of rake that out of the way so it won't interfere with your seeding or your seeder. Also, by raking that back, it allows you to see what perennial weeds are there, because again, the tarp won't kill those. So you will want to go through and hand pull any perennial weeds that you can spot. In my case, I'm dealing with some dock, and it's really not that bad to just go through and get those pulled out of the way. So after that, you can come through and just kind of grade out the bed. I'm just using a hard rake on my scale, but you could use like also a tilther attachment on like a BCS tractor. From there, we're pretty much ready to seed. So I have some kale seed, and I think I'm seeding half of a bed. So this is broadcast sowing. So I'm just broadcast sowing by hand. And I've really worked over the past couple of years to try to figure out how to do that and get the desired density. So I kind of have my own little method where I meter the seed with my thumb in circular motions, and I'll come back through and kind of look down to see if I missed any spots. And sometimes you miss the spots kind of on the margins, so coming back through and hitting those. That seed needs to be worked in, and what I've found works really well is a leaf rake where you straighten out the tines at the end, and then you kind of do this little bouncing motion, which just kind of works that seed in without moving it all around. It just kind of works it into the soil. It goes really, really fast. So that's what I'm doing there with the leaf rake. Another tool you can use to work seed in are these little mini cultivators, and I mean, I like the leaf rake so much more. It's so much faster, and I feel like I have to lean less, but the mini cultivator works to work in seed. This is like a cheap one from Tractor Supply. They make nicer ones, but honestly, I'm just kind of sold on the leaf rake method. There's another method called the chain drag, and I tried that method, and I really wasn't pleased with the results, so I'm not even going to show you it, but you're welcome to look at that as another option. So that's all seeded up. Take the irrigation. I'm going to put that back in place. This irrigation, it's the we'll have a whole class on irrigation, but this stuff's a little flimsy, and especially when it doesn't have water in the line. but you can just put like a 2x4, or they even have stakes to hold it in place, but it's kind of a pain to mess with. After that's in place, I'm going to come through with a really light straw dressing, and this straw does a lot of things. It covers the soil to an extent. We can't cover the soil so much that the seeds can't germinate through, but it covers it as to, mitigate, the damages from having bare soil when it rains. But it also reduces evaporation, and it's gonna help those seeds germinate better. And as long as you don't do it too thick, as long as you can still kind of see the soil through the straw, your seeds are gonna come right up through that straw. Okay. And then here's a bed that I did a couple weeks ago, and you can see, I think these are mustard greens. They're looking really good, and I don't really have a lot of annual weed pressure because I've done a pretty good job to manage that. I'm pulling up some oak saplings there, which are perennial, so no big deal. So that was a little demo on broadcast sowing. Next we want to look at precision seeding. So precision seeding, this can be done by hand on a small scale, but once you get into more of a market scale, you're going to want to get a precision seeder, either an Earthway or a Jang, depending on your budget. The seed bed must be clean, just like with any direct seeding. So you really need a clean seed bed. Your plantings, because if you're using a precision seeder, your plantings are going to be in straight rows, unlike broadcast sowing where it covers the whole bed. The spaces in between the rows are easy to weed, and they're easy to mulch. So it's a little bit more manageable from the weeding side compared to broadcast sowing if you do have weed pressure. Thinning does become necessary. So with these precision seeders, you're usually going to make the settings to where you're seeding the plants closer together than you ultimately want them. And this is just to make sure you get a good stand. And then from there, you can go back and thin them to the appropriate spacings. So let's go ahead and take a look at what precision seeding looks like. So here's a Jang precision seeder. So what I have there is a detachable hopper, and the hopper has these rollers inside of it, and the rollers are what meters the seed, and you have to match the roller to the size that fits your seed. So this roller, for example, is a 12 slot roller, and it fits seeds as large as like cilantro, okra, things like that. And they have all different sizes and shapes, for whether you're doing carrots, beets, cilantro, chard, you can find a roller that'll work. So what I'm doing right now is I'm taking this cilantro seed and I'm making sure I have the right roller, and see how those seeds fit in there like that. Great. So I found the right roller. I'm going to put it back into the hopper and put that pin back through. That pin connects to the gear system and helps disperse the seed. All right, so after I get that safety pin in there, we're all good. The hopper's ready for seed. I'm going to fill it up with seed. So I have cilantro seed in there. Put the lid on. Put the hopper back on the machine. It's a quick attachment. So now I know I have the right roller in place and I have the seeds in the hopper. Now I need to figure out my gears. The gears are going to control the spacing. So it depends on the roller. So I have a 12-hole roller, so I've spotted that, and I figure out what I want my spacing to be. I think I want my spacing to be 5 inches on these cilantro. So if I use that little chart, it's hard to see, but that chart tells me that to have 5-inch spacing on a 12-hole roller, I need to have, I think, a 14 gear in the back and a 9 in the front. And I think whatever I was seeding before, it was the opposite. So I'm just gonna swap that. There's the numbers on there. So that's a size 14 and a size 9. So I swapped that. I got 14 in the back, 9 in the front. Pop that in place, adjust the links, and then put that back on. So now my spacing is going to be right. So there's so much you can do with these seeders. You can do all different types of seeds, and you can do all different types of spacing. It's really cool. This seeder, it makes the furrow, it drops the seed, and it covers the seed back up and then gives it a little tamp with the wheel. It does it all. All you have to do is just push it. Right now I'm just making sure the seeds are coming out before, and they are. So I'm going to put my seeder in place. I'm kind of using my irrigation lines as a guide for my rows. And right now I'm just kind of pulling those taut, so I have, as straight of a guide as possible. Put a little board over those to hold those in place. And I'm ready to go. You don't want to walk on your beds. We haven't really talked about that as far as etiquette, but we want to stay off of our beds. We want to walk in the paths. So the Jang has an adjustable handle that you can move to one side or the other to accommodate that. So right now I'm doing that first row, and just look at that. All I'm doing is pushing it, and it's dropping those seeds and in the furrows that it's making and covering it right back up. So you can do a lot of bed feet in a short period of time with a seeder like this. So there's another little close-up view. Just like that. It's amazing. And I think I'm able, with my beds are like 4 feet wide, so I think I'm able to get like 5 rows per bed on this cilantro. There it goes again. Really can't wait for you all to be able to come out here and get to use this stuff hands-on. But for now, just imagine. So just like with broadcast sowing, after you've done precision seeding, you're gonna do a light straw mulch to reduce evaporation, protect the soil, and increase germination. So I'm just using the straw that I had raked aside earlier when I was cleaning off the bed. And again, it's a fine balance. If you go too heavy on the straw, the seeds won't be able to pop up through it. And if you don't go heavy enough, your soil is going to dry out and be vulnerable to erosion. So I wanted to show you this shot real quick. Make sure to let your straw bales cure. Let them get wet and let all that wheat seed germinate in the bales. All right. So it's not germinating in your beds. After you're done, you can empty the seed hopper, and the reason I put all that seed in there, it's the weight of the seed that kind of forces the seeds down into the roller, so it helps to have a lot of seed. And there's kind of a finished look at the results. Those are some radishes I direct seeded with the Jang, so you can see they came up really well. They just need a little bit of thinning now. All right, well, I think that sums up the basics of plant starting. Just to recap, we talked about transplanting and we talked about direct seeding. And with transplanting, we started, with making your own potting mix, growing plants in the greenhouse, transplanting those into the field. And with direct seeding, we talked about broadcast sowing and using precision seeders. So if you still have any questions, feel free to watch the presentation again. Feel free to send over any other questions to my email. I'd be happy to address those for you. So next class, we're going to be looking at bed prep. We're going to talk about how we can establish beds to have low weed pressure and without using tillage. So it's a really exciting class. We might try to do a live class. So I'm going to be working on that this week to try to see if somehow we could join like a platform like Zoom or Google Hangouts. So I'll try to get that figured out this week, and by next weekend, try to get you all set up for that if that's the direction we do go. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, enjoy your week. I don't think we'll have a reading for next class. These two classes don't have pre-readings, but there will be a reading for the class after next. So just look out for course details coming up for bed preparation. And don't forget to schedule a consultation with me, whether we do it in person or virtually. I'm offering everybody free consultation services if you're in the course. So I would love to see what you all are working on and see if I can be of any service to you. Other than that, have a great week and talk soon.